Hi, everybody. We are back again with a new episode of Dev Propulsion Labs. Today, we're talking about product design. Product design for developer tools is an art and science, and we're here with the star lineup to chat about the nuances of how to design nice dev tools. So I would like to introduce our panel first. Today we have Joel Hawksley, staff engineer at GitHub and the genius behind the ViewComponent. Do you want to give a quick intro to everybody?
Yeah, sure. I'm a staff engineer here at GitHub. I'm the closest thing we have to a UI architect at this point, and I work on various things around the company that pertain to UI strategy. And at this point, that is mainly around accessibility. So I've been doing accessibility work for the company for about a year now.
Awesome, thank you. Next we have Shannon Soper, an accomplished product designer previously at Postman and Gatsby. Shannon, do you want to give a short intro as well?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to work with awesome people at Developer Tools Company so far. I've really liked it. I'm in Amsterdam right now, just on a sabbatical after living in the Bay Area working at Postman. So yeah, after my sabbatical, start looking for my next role at the end of July and just having a lot of fun.
Exciting. Next, we have Anton Lovchikov, our very own product designer. He works at Evil Martians and builds amazing developer tools for our clients. Anton,
Yeah.
a quick word
Hi,
too.
everybody. Nice to meet you. Thank you for invitation. Yeah, I've been working as a designer since 2005. And yeah, currently my main focus is dev tools, design, product design at Evil Martians. And yeah, I'm very excited to discuss all these cool questions that you prepared for us.
Awesome. Next, we have Ayush Iyer, Director of Product Engineering and UX at Algolia, previously UX at Twilio. Ayush, a quick word to you.
Hey all, it's good to meet you all. I'm really happy to be here. Uh, as you said, my name's Ayush. I work at Algolia and I lead the user experience and UI platform teams. We build a bunch of search and discovery APIs that companies use to establish search around the world. I also worked at Twilio before this, which is a communications customer engagement company. My background's in product design. I used to be a journalist before that. Really good to talk to you today.
Awesome. Finally, we have Jessica Ko, the dynamic co-founder and CEO at Playbook. Jessica?
Hi, saying hello from San Francisco. I'm a CEO and co-founder of Playbook.com, where we're a creative storage for designers and marketers and brand designers, and prompt artists now these days. I've been a designer for over a decade. I worked at Google. I worked at on Google Drive, YouTube. I was head of design at Open Door. I started to Playbook about almost 4 years ago now. So we have about 200,000 users, mostly designers and marketers. Yeah, very nice to meet you.
Awesome. It's great to have you guys here. And let's start with the question. So we tend to begin these sessions with a very high level question. And let's talk about design for developer tools. How is it different from any other consumer facing products? And let's start with Shannon here. Shannon, what do you think is so special about design and developer tools?
Sure, yeah. So I was thinking about my first experience as a product designer at Gatsby. My previous career was something else. So the very first thing I designed was the plugin library. And some of my first sketches, I shared them in a Slack community that was for like broad product design. And then I also shared them with Gatsby's open source community to get feedback from both sources. And from the broad community, where almost nobody was designing developer tools, most were designing consumer-facing products, they said the design was too cluttered. And then the developer community, open source community was like, oh, this is awesome. So I was like very surprised at the difference between the two responses. And what I've discovered is I actually don't think developer tools are extremely different from other professional tools, like technical tools, but developers are professionals. It requires a lot of expertise to do that job. And you just need a lot of data to make creative decisions when you're using a technical tool. So if a user is evaluating several different source plugins to pull data into their Gatsby website, they want to see like installation instructions. They want to see who the author was, how many downloads there are, how reliable this plugin is, has been recently updated. Whereas somebody ordering an Uber is making a split-second decision on like, oh, that car's cheaper, or like that one's big enough. So those are pretty different experiences. So developers need more data, and the design is gonna, it might look cluttered to someone who's used to seeing a lot more white space, but it can often, it's the right decision if it presents the right data to users at the right time.
Okay, thank you. Bill, do you want to continue on this kind of like on this topic? Because I know that GitHub is one of those tools that like almost all engineers in the world use, or at least are familiar with. Do you want to chime in on how its design is probably different from any other consumer product out there?
For sure, yeah. I think what's really interesting about GitHub's approach is we actually have a very specific like GitHub term for this exact phenomenon, which is what we call cooking for chefs, which is to say that like we are developers and we're building software for other developers. And that philosophy permeates basically everything we do as a company. For those of you who aren't familiar, GitHub didn't even have product managers or managers at all for the first like 6 or 7 years as a company. And that was because we just naturally were able to build what our customers wanted because we were basically our own customers. And that really permeated through our design process as well. There were some downsides to that, though, that we're really starting to see now as the company has matured. That like, while we were representative of a lot of our customers, we weren't representative of all of them. We were becoming a bigger company, which means we weren't seeing the world the way that like maybe smaller companies would, but we also weren't as big as some of our biggest customers. So it can go both ways when you're building dev tools, that you can feel like you have a lot of empathy for your customers, and that can be really useful to a point. Another thing we really see is that like compared to other products I've worked on, kind of as Shannon was saying, the level of expertise is generally higher. So like, while we do have new software engineers that we cater to at GitHub, those software engineers are still technical people. So like kind of like the band that we're trying to cater to is much narrower than I think that a lot of consumer products would be. And that I think ultimately makes things easier because you don't have to like have your application have such a wide range of complexity. You can kind of focus on one specific level of complexity in a certain area.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Anton, as a person who works on multiple developer tools, throughout his career, what do you think are some commonalities that developer tools have that sets them apart from any other like consumer-facing products?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I would like to start with like discussing the term developer tools. I apply quite a broad understanding and quite a broad definition, and I will use this definition throughout all my answers. And I look at these like these. There are basically two types of products. One of them are created for consuming something, and another group, it's a product that's created for creating something new from scratch. And it doesn't matter what it is. It might be IDE for coding, or it might be sound editing application, or graphic editor or something like that. All of them welcome a new user with empty canvas, and user starts to create something. And all of these products in the second group shares quite similar features. And the main one, the crucial one that I think, is absence of such a thing as a golden path. What I mean, in consuming projects, you have like a funnel, for example, e-commerce, right? You have a funnel of a new customer who goes through the catalog, picks some products, buys it, and that's kind of a conversion into payment. And designer working on such kind of products, they optimize interface around this funnel, around this golden flow. And there is no such a thing in developer tools, because tool. So a person takes this tool at any moment of their everyday work and use the way that they need. And they might not use all the features, all the functionality of the tool, and just use just a fraction of it. And if we try to apply the same approach with funnel and golden path, in this case, we will be trying to optimize the interface around reaching the key action, but key action might not be the reason why a person uses this tool. They might just type the codes and not execute these codes, but copying it and pasting it into some other application. And that's the main reason, that's the main difference between developer tool and other products.
Okay, awesome. The next question would be, let's say developer tool is a professional tool that people use on a daily basis. They spend a ton of time working in it. Playbook is a little bit different. It's not a developer tool per se. It's a tool for designers, and maybe some other creatives that are they just need to store and create some new resources. Jessica, what do you think is the main kind of challenge in ensuring a seamless UX for those users that spend a ton of time in your product?
Yeah. Speaking for design tools, it's any SaaS companies out there, any SaaS tools, or productivity tools, same as developer tools, is that it's very competitive. And we're all looking to find tools that make us 10x productive. So unless we are really, really, making things better, making it so much better than what's existing out there, it's going to be really, really hard to stay alive as a productivity company. And unless you're GitHub, of course. GitHub is huge. We use GitHub as well. But it's so any startups, there's a ton of startups like productivity tools out there, and everyone wants to have their every developer, every designer have their ideas of what would make them 10x productive. So we're competing against them, and the bar gets higher and higher and higher every month and every year. So that is the challenge we have to face. So we have to make certain product leaps in order to make that possible. And I think that's true for every startup.
Okay, awesome. Ayush, what do you think about what is the main challenge in developer tools? What stops us from achieving that seamless UX? What's the biggest concern for product teams?
Yeah, that's such a great, really, really complex and multivariate question. I think the answer changes so much based on the size of the company you are, the types of customers you talk to, and as you grow as well. A couple of things that have stayed true through my time really are this idea of mismatched empathy. I think Joel talked about it briefly around the idea of when you have a strong understanding as a developer of what you need in a tool, it can override all the signals you get from developers who don't work like you, who don't look like you, who don't speak like you, don't have the same vernaculars. And it's very easy to reject specific types of data. So making sure that you are able to effectively compartmentalize the kind of information you're getting from customers in order to make sure that you're making the right features for each type of developer and not the average developer is super, super important. I think that also helps you in understanding different kinds of cohorts, because I think it's very easy to talk about no-code developers or extremely technical developers, but as you start segmenting your customers a lot more and start thinking about people who are building modules or composing interfaces, it starts getting a lot more specific to your own use case and customer. So being able to clearly identify the kind of customer you're talking to and truly understand their needs is very important. A couple of other things that come to my mind are, one big thing that's mattered for me as a very, very poor developer, but one who tries to be a better one every day, is transparency, which is, can your developer tools and services unpack the black box of how it's working? Because that gives me confidence in how it works. A big thing that we see at Algolia, a thing that we've seen in companies before this, is the proof of how is the service working and how does it make my product or my business better? And if you can explain that in ways that are or demonstrate that through the product in ways that are clearer, it leads to better buy-in, it leads to better vetting, because eventually that's what these tools lead to. And making sure that, customers truly understand what happens when you use a service, as opposed to expecting magic. Definitely, magic is a beautiful attribute that gets you through the sign-up funnel. But when you get to the vetting process, when you get to actually using it in a system, you want trust and reliability, and that's when the black box should open up. And the last one I'll add is, it's really important to not think about just building developer tools or APIs. Like, we have to recognize the responsibility of the products we're building. At Twilio, for example, our messaging and phone services were used for lifelines and emergency services very often. And like, the idea of like building something just as a tool is not, you don't really understand the responsibility of it until you realize the ways it is used. So always recognizing the responsibility of how it's built is super, super important. So those are the three things that stay evergreen in my mind as challenges while building good UX for tools.
Okay, thank you. Anton, as a designer, what are some principles that you prioritize in achieving that seamless UX?
Yeah, I think that the main challenge when designing a dev tool comes from two basic features that every developer tool has. The first one, and the whole point of using a developer tool, is that developer tool should boost your productivity. It should make you with a developer tool much more efficient than you without this developer tool. Mm-hmm. And which means the developer tool should give you an access to the functionality that you currently need in the current moment. And the second feature is that developer tool is used by people for many hours every day. So it's very intense work. And this intense work creates a lot of cognitive load to the user, and a good developer tool should try to reduce this cognitive load. And these two features are actually mutually exclusive, because if we optimize productivity, it means that we need to bring all the features, expose all the features to the canvas, to the interface, and it will give us very bloated interface, but it will be very accessible in terms of functionality. So a user might perform all the needed action quite quickly. But if we optimize on the side of cognitive load, in this case, we need to clean everything up and hide all the functionality under the drop-down menus or other things. And the main challenge actually is how to gather these two extremities together, because you need an interface that's efficient in terms of functionality and very easy to use. And it's like, I consider it as a slider. A designer needs to make a decision to move the slider at some position, and the slider on the left gives very like a black canvas interface with just main functionality and everything other hidden somewhere in menus, and on the right position it gives very bloated cockpit interface but with a lot of buttons, but all the action is performed with just one click. And so you need to find the sweet spot, and that's the main challenge. But there is like a real challenge, which I consider this way. Trying to put this slider at some position, it's a compromise. It's like, okay, we investigated our users and we found that this functionality is needed only by 5% of them, so we will hide it in the dropdown. Yeah, that's kind of a solution, but you make the life of these 5% users harder. And the real challenge is trying to avoid these compromising, trying to find such solution that allows you to have the functionality, but without interface. And for doing that, designers should work very tightly with engineers, with front ends, with back end, trying to find some algorithms or other things to make it happen.
Yeah. Joel, do you want to expand a little bit on finding that balance between productivity and something else?
For sure. Yeah. I think that what Anton was speaking to is something we struggle with a ton at GitHub, because there's just so much we could show on a given page. And kind of as Anton was hinting at, a lot of what we do is we think about like what is shown on the page is like the common denominator of what we expect most customers of our product to want to have on a given page. And then we'll add things on a layer behind, whether it's through a key command or through like a little triple dot menu on a comment, for example, where maybe that's where we put the 5% features. But really, like, one of the main challenges we see is that we frame our product design as competing with the command line, that developers work on the command line all day, and the command line is incredibly consistent and incredibly performant. And when we build a web application, it is going to be less consistent and less performant than a command line interface. So we view that as kind of like the standard, and we're working to be as close to that standard as possible, which might mean that, like, say our performance standards are maybe 100 milliseconds for an interaction that on a typical web application might be 1,000 milliseconds, because we need to get closer to that, 50 millisecond or 20 millisecond latency that you get on a CLI. That's a really high standard, right? And that can have a lot of other effects in the process. One of the outcomes of this, specifically when it comes to striving for consistency, is that I don't want to say it leads to a lack of creativity, but it certainly is a constraint on the amount of divergence we can have in our design and our application. And this really can throw off designers that come to GitHub from other non-DevTools products, because they're used to maybe making a new part of their product that is like flashier and looks very different from the other parts of the product. And that can work well in non-DevTool environments, but we find we've actually tried that approach. Discussions is a good example of that. We went a little bit further off like our common design language, and we actually really paid the price of that, where it was unfamiliar to people. It was really expensive to maintain. It was really hard to get to that level of consistency and performance that we had in the rest of our application.
Okay, thank you. And then as we continue kind of uncovering the nuances of professional tools, we have to talk about different user personas, different levels of professionalism of people that come to use the product. So, Shannon, do you want to talk about how to find that balance between different user personas when we're talking about beginners, maybe some more experienced developers, and like power users? How do you find that balance?
Sure, I'd love to. So the balance of beginner versus intermediate versus power users, I think mostly comes from evaluating where the biggest pain points are for any category of those users, and then comparing that with your business needs, because you have to make money so that your company can continue to exist and keep making good things. So figuring out like, where are you making money from and what hiccups are happening in that. So like, if you're not getting enough new users, like the current users love it, but you're not getting enough new users, you got to look at why. If you're getting tons of new users and then they all give up once they're like into the product, got to figure out why. So I think balancing users' needs with kind of a broader product perspective is important. As far as like from a practical sense, like beginners they shouldn't stay beginners forever. So like the UI for beginners is often like an initial flow that then drops them into where they're going to be intermediate, like Anton was describing, where they're having their kind of like creative activities every day, or maybe they don't visit that often, but so you drop them in there and then they're intermediate there, and maybe they go through kind of a beginner experience, like mini beginner experiences if they try a new feature for the first time, or they come back to something they haven't done for a really long time. So yeah, I kind of think of like flows as a beginner thing, like it's the first time you've done something. And then for intermediate users, I totally agree with Anton that you want to like surface stuff that's the most common actions. And things that are a little less common, you might want to provide like tool tips and field labels, because even intermediate users need reminders sometimes. And then advanced users, you need to give them access to being able to manipulate data in ways that you didn't expect. So download CSV files of logs, maybe like make APIs exposed and available so users can try to mold the product in open-ended ways.
Okay. Anton, do you want to expand on that a little bit? On finding balance or maybe best practices in balancing those needs?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I consider this question as a continuation of the previous one because it's really the same conflict of making something welcoming to a new user versus making it very efficient in terms of everyday work. And yeah, let's see. Beginners, they are less demanding to minor functionality, and their needs and their tasks that they are going to perform at the beginning within the application is quite typical and it's quite the same. But at the same time, they have lower cognitive capacity because it's something new. They may be new for the whole field, like a language or concept of programming or doing something else. And it gives us idea that the ideal interface for a beginner should be these Zen modes with a very clean interface with just a few main features exposed. Advanced users, on the other hand, they have more unique tasks. And yeah, to be honest, you as a developer of developer tools never know how your users is going to use your tool. And you like when we started investigate this deeply in our projects, we were quite surprised by use cases that we found. So yeah, these users are have more unique tasks. They are demanding to some particular functionality and the time of reach to this functionality. But they have greater like tolerance to cognitive overload. They used to use complicated interfaces and so on. So yeah, the same conflict. And the solution that I can see here is that I would avoid something like initial masters or something like that adjusts the interface based on user choice, like welcome, how do you consider your level, are you a beginner or advanced? That's quite a tricky path because like relying on everything that comes from a user that affects greatly the interface, it's not a great idea because all people, somebody can underestimate their experience, somebody can overestimate, and actually it's very difficult to make this choice without understanding what will be affected by this choice, without seeing the interface for the first place. And the solution is that I apply quite like the standards strategy. I start with quite clean interface with the basic functionality that is needed by the vast majority of the users. And I give an ability to adjust the toolboxes, toolbars, menus, and so on. And example of that you can find in Mail app or in Finder in macOS. They allows you to bring some functionality, delete some functionality from the bar. So user starts using these basic functionality that we prepared for them. And after that, they realize that they perform some hidden functionality every day, and they just able to drag it to the main toolbox. And now they optimize the time of reaching of this feature. And one more tool that is good for using is using command K interface. It's like a God pop-up that exists on top of whole interface that originally it provided just a list of hotkeys that exists within the application, but recently it's evolved into basically command line interface. It's like you can perform some actions that might be not even exposed and not have the visual representation in the interface, but you can make these action using this command key. And it's, yeah, for advanced users, it's quite convenience because you have all the lists that you can perform with this entity that's currently presented on the screen. So yeah, making the starting interface clean, given ability to expand it when user ready and needs it, and having kind of God interface, command line like interface that allows you to perform any action from any place of the interface. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jessica, do you want to share your side of your point of view on this in terms of the product owner? What, as a product, how do you balance those needs?
Yeah.
And how do you make sure it aligns with the strategy and all? Yeah.
When I heard that question, I actually the beginner to me was not the beginner of the product, but actual beginner designer. The people who are just graduating from college, or intermediate designers who've been around 3, 4, 5 years, and then senior designers, or it's been around for over a decade. That's how I actually viewed it. But I guess in developer tool sense, maybe it might be slightly different. As a UX designer myself, I always think of every user as a beginner. I almost never think of them as advanced users. But again, I think that's sort of a habit that carried over from my old jobs working on consumer products facing, like YouTube, for example. There's no advanced users. To me, to us, it's like every person is a beginner. Everyone makes the same mistakes. But in terms of growth, like beginner, say that we're talking about new grads, artists or intermediate artists. Usually, senior designers or experienced people tend to bring their old habits with them. So tackling them is very different than tackling the people who comes in with extremely open-minded, that never really built any habits in the past. So, for example, when you build a startup or build design tools like Playbook, it's a lot easier to get feedback from people who are just starting out, because it's very common sense almost. But the senior people, experience sort of expertise, who's actually dealt with digital asset managers in the past or work with Dropbox all the time, they have very specific needs because they're so used to certain tools in the past. So that's how I understand the gauge, that feedback's coming from both. But it's most of the time, again, I tend to, if one person can, have a trouble dealing with this, I'm pretty sure the experienced person will also deal with this too. And it's also especially true for a company like ours, who's been around only for 2 years. As we're building more and more and more features on top of it, every new person who joined 2 years ago is still new to our product, is constantly building new features at a speed of, we're just building because we're trying to build something from 0 to 1. So again, every person on our platform, I consider them beginner. So that's how I build the product.
Awesome. Thank you. Ayush, is there anything you want to add to this conversation of finding the balance between different user personas?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating conversation. There's so much good here in what's been said. Jessica, the thing you mentioned about every user being a beginner is so valuable. Like, I've used Figma a lot, I've used GitHub a lot, but I join a new organization's repo or I join a new community folder and I have no idea what's going on. It takes me a few days to figure out what the norms are, what's the right place to write commit, what's the right places to put edits. If I detach a symbol, am I going to become a monster? There's a lot of things there. But I really want to go back to the point that Shannon mentioned initially about the business, because I think that's super valuable. I think to balance needs of different personas, it really is important to understand your organizational perspective. Like, what are you doing for your key business metrics? Are you really focused on developer signups? Or are enterprise sales really mattering for you? Like, what stage of the organization you're in? Because typically, the in for your business is the persona you tend to overbuild for, and the one that you typically have to rebalance from. But when you're rebalancing, the really, really important challenge is, while you're balancing different personas, you also have to have a recognition of the spaces that exist in between these personas. A really good example we saw recently with Algolia is we launched a whole suite of merchandising features. Merchandising, as a TLDR, is the rearranging of the digital storefront you can get when you have search or discovery API. So when you search for something, what do you see? Algolia is a deeply technical product, and to implement search and discovery, you need developers. But the teams that are actually doing merchandising are called merchandisers, a business analyst, a product analyst, who may not have a strong understanding of developer tools or the design. So what makes these customers and the key business successful? Is it the API or the ways that business analysts or merchandisers can use it? So recognizing the spaces between these two different personas, and they aren't even on the scale of beginner, intermediate, expert in terms of developer. They're a complete different market. But the reality in most modern developer ecosystems is the teams that make them successful aren't just the developers themselves. It's the billing team to make sure that your pricing is transparent and you're not surprised by the fact that at the end of the month you got a huge check or you don't know what you're spending for. It's a privacy team to make sure that your customers' data is maintained properly. It's the analyst team who's actually using the data in a positive way. So making sure that the communities of different personas that you're building for are successful together is the really, really important thing that we think about from a product perspective. Now, the actual vernaculars of how that is applied across design can be very specific. In general, though, I will say that it's important to not assume that any customer landing on some place is already an expert or already a developer, because it might be their first day on the job, having 20 years of experience, and you still have to have an onboard time. So I would never trade off approachability for expertise. I think both of them are deeply interlinked. And making sure that you're doing that across a community stack of personas is very important from that perspective.
Yeah. And I feel like in getting the product to the place where it needs to be, we really need to be listening to our customers, right? And collecting that feedback and incorporating that feedback into your product cycles is extremely important. So my question would be, how do you actually gather feedback from your developer community, and how do you integrate that into your iterations? Joel, do you want to start this kind of segue this part of discussion?
Yeah, sure. This is something I'm really familiar with at GitHub. For a while, I was the engineering manager for what we would call our feature delivery tooling. So we had a bunch of really interesting techniques that I think served GitHub really well. The first one is what we just call a staff ship, which is that when we're building a new feature, the first thing we do, literally from day one, is we turn it on for new staff. And this is usually 6 months to a year before the feature is generally available. And we find that catches probably 75 to 90% of all the concerns that we'll see with a new feature is just having our own people use it. And what's really nice about that process is that often when people find something that they disagree with, they'll just go write a PR that fixes it. And that's their feedback, is like, this is what I would do differently. And that can be really efficient. Like, you get really quick feedback loops that can happen, multiple times a day, which is really beneficial for rapidly iterating on a product. From there, we keep a group of people under NDA. I think it's a few hundred at this point. We call it our maintainers group. And that's just a group of people that are representative customers in the industry that have signed a non-disclosure agreement that we can share new features with. So we'll create a new issue in a private repo with them, saying, here's what we're doing, here are our goals, here's what we want feedback on, and then we just turn it on for them. They're used to this. They're used to seeing new features kind of pop up, and they know not to post screenshots on Twitter. Then what we do is we'll do a private beta, which is something many of you have probably seen with features like Copilot and others, where you put your email on a list, and we use the same feature flagging tooling. It's a tool called Flipper that adds you into the feature. And then from there, we do a public beta. And we use a tool called Feature Preview that many of you have probably seen. It's where you get the blue dot at the top of GitHub where it says, hey, there's a new feature available for you to try. Do you want to opt into using it? We get really good uptake for this. This is actually one of the core features that I built worked on building with my team when I was the manager of the feature delivery team. And I think we see at least 10% engagement of all of our active users trying those kind of public betas. And from there, we basically, at each step of this process, we have some feedback forms built in, and we handle that feedback often directly to the customer, which I think is really fun. That, like, if someone submits feedback, we'll say, hey, we got this. This is what we're going to do, whether it's a won't fix or we will fix it. And then we'll actually often validate our fix with that customer specifically and say, hey, what do you think of this proposed feature? We might even get on a call with them and run a design by them. And that's kind of our process. From there, we get to GA, and that's when we remove all of the feature flag tooling.
That sounds like a very extensive and thorough process. And I mean, for a company like GitHub with, I don't know, millions of users, it's required. Jessica, do you want to share how it works for a company that is a little bit smaller yet for now? How does it work for a smaller startup?
So how does it
How do
work?
you get feedback from users and how do you integrate it into your iterations?
Oh, in a small startup, it's very much 50-50. So we have places where users give us feedback and they want features they want to see. But there's a 50% of time we make decisions based on intuitions. We as in mostly, one or two people. Is usually, consensus-driven product decisions. You don't make leaps. When I was going back talking about building a productivity tool that makes people 10x, you have to make leaps of stuff. Usually what people are asked is just like one step ahead of like making their life like tiny bit easier. Because we're all like, I can only see what's in front of us. Just like most users, they are trying to use our tool, they can see what's in front of us. But if you want to truly like take some big bets, you do have to go work on things that are based on completely on your intuition. So you have to find those balance because you want to make sure that you're making sure that existing product that's out there people are using, which you want to make sure that experience is great, but at the same time, can we make $1 billion business just doing this, or are we constantly making big bets, big bold bets? So I always tell people it's got to be almost 50-50.
Okay, thank you. Shannon, how about what's your stance on gathering and incorporating feedback? And maybe you can share some best practices that you have used in your in your previous experiences.
Sure, yeah. I really liked hearing what Joel and Jessica said. I think it's important to have a question that really needs answering. And it kind of depends on those kinds of like the type of question depends on what stage you're at. If you're like super early and you're just like, do people even value this thing or care about it? Like that's the question. And then you have to pursue research that answers it. And then like later on, sometimes you get into really specific questions where you're like, okay, for the people who filled out this form on the website, but then never submitted it, why didn't they do it? That's like an extremely specific question. And there's different tactics for answering both. I want to share like one experience I had that was kind of more broad and then one that was really specific. So at Gatsby, I joined right when the startup started. I was the first employee other than the founders. And so we were still in the stage of like, what are the users even thinking? Like, obviously people were excited. And so I just started like anyone who mentioned Gatsby on Twitter, I would just like respond to their tweet and just say, hey, like, I'd love to hear your perspective on what's working for you, what's not working for you. And people were so excited. Actually, a few people thought I was like an interloper from another like competitor. They're like, who are you? So I had to ask the founders to start like liking my tweets, my responses. And then they're like, okay, this person's legit. And like 95% of people that I messaged would talk to me. And it was awesome. And we needed kind of that wide net at first. A contrasting experience at Postman was we would get data on like, okay, here's all the people that upgraded after their 2-week trial experience. What were all the features they used during their trial compared to people who didn't upgrade? Let's get a segment of these users that meet a certain profile, send them a survey, and then to ask them why they upgraded. And then the last question on the survey, this is like a trick I love, is to ask them, are you willing to answer follow-up questions about your survey responses? The people who say yes to that are really likely to show up to an interview and be very enthusiastic. Yeah, it's hard to get a hold of people who just don't care or who like don't have time or something didn't work for them. So sometimes like that was the last thing I was going to mention is like compensating people for their time. I think you have to do either like free, like they're volunteering their time and they must value it enough to volunteer, and that is a way to like respect people, like you're respecting that they're willing to volunteer, or pay them like 1.5 times their hourly rate. Giving someone like a $20 Amazon gift card is like, my opinion is, and experience is, it doesn't work. Nobody cares about that. Swag is also surprisingly successful from my perspective. People love swag.
Yeah. Actually, just a side note, we were just debating what's the best way to say, like, to call merchandise. Is it merchandise? Is it swag? Is like what's the right word to call the branded items? You know, I launched like a quick survey on Twitter and I got 50-50 merch and swag, so we're undecided still. Yeah. Anyways, let's come back to product design for developer tools. Next topic is a big one. And I mean, Martians spend a lot of time actually developing products to achieve that. Let's talk about accessibility. Let's talk about accessibility and inclusivity in developer tools. How do we ensure that, you know, our products cater to a diverse range of users? And let's start with Ayush and his experience and stance on this matter.
Yeah, this is definitely a topic that's close to my heart. I think like the grim version of me says that inclusive design is always at war with late stage capitalism, and you got to figure out which one's going to win very often, because good arguments about doing the right thing for customers are always fought against what is the most important thing for us to grow as a business. And sometimes, like, the unfortunate reality is very often people make decisions that are anti-user but pro-business. So my first framework, my first guiding principle I give to most teams when I'm building accessible products in my time is like, don't only rely on good citizen arguments to build accessible and inclusive design, because that will require the entire organization around you to be able to be co-signing that. And the cost of doing that, it's an important thing to do and you should believe it, but I think that it's not really viable in larger organizations where people have different motivations. It's really, really important to connect the dots between the organization culture of what you're trying to do and how can you build an inclusive design practice. For example, at Algolia, we build search and discovery APIs. The way people see value in our search and discovery APIs is if they find things that are interesting to them and they access them. And thus, if your UI is not performant, if your UI is not accessible, you will see the data in your conversions. So effectively, there is not even a dotted line. It's a solid line between an accessible product and good business value. So that becomes a really, really strong anchoring argument to say, this is why we practice inclusive design. In other places, that line may be dotted or be a very, very shaded line, for example, where you can only correlate but not causally link. At that point in time, you can see if you can articulate it as a business problem to say, hey, we might be at risk of exposure, we might be at risk of pre-login accessibility and making sure that we're in compliance. There are a number of different ways you can sell the argument. From a practical perspective, when you're organizing work streams, the one piece that I have found super valuable is to not make accessibility a specific line item. Because the moment you make something like make X accessible as an improvement, as far as possible, it always has a risk of being deprioritized by some product manager, product designer, or engineering team down the line, simply because there may not be expertise on it. There might be other tickets in place. So one piece that we defined early on at Twilio, and we're doing this at Algolia as well, is making sure that the definition of done and the definition of ready includes an accessible, inclusive criteria. This makes the base common denominator of all the work that we're doing accessible and inclusive. And yes, there will be lifts that you occasionally have to do for VPAD. There'll be lifts you've got to do to like upgrade your design systems, etc. And I think that becomes, but the base idea is don't make it an explicit item, make it implicit in all the work that you do. The challenge with making things as implicit as in everything that you do is to make sure that you're not swinging inclusive design principles like a bat, because that has a tendency to put people off. You want to win people's hearts over rather than force them to do the right thing. And so the way you communicate practices around inclusive design and accessibility and the arguments you use to say, hey, this is how it might help, A common example I always dealt with was disabled buttons in UX early on in my design career, around why folks will say, oh, the easiest way to show that a form is not valid is just disable the button so that once every single form field is filled, it'll turn on and you're good. And that works for anyone who knows exactly how the form works, which again is a function of you're only talking to customers within your organization. But if you don't know how a form works, you might actually need error messages or labels, which will actually guide you. So in that case, a button that submits and that gives you an error which is clearly visible saying, here are the reasons why we could not submit a form, actually improves inclusive design. So the way we communicate some of these practices and the way we share our knowledge across the organization and our peers becomes an important aspect, like making sure that we can reach out to a vast variety of users. And the last thing, and we say this often, is make sure that you're not thinking about the average user in your conversations. It's always about each and every user, treating them not as a monolith, because monoliths tend to be considered places where you can reduce features, but considering a wide range of spectrum of users is really, really important from an accessibility perspective.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Jessica, now on to you and maybe your experience with, your journey to inclusivity and accessibility with your product. Yeah, share your opinion, please.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, we're always behind. Just when you're building new features constantly, we're always it's always a sort of not the most important priority. When you're in a survival mode, basically, accessibility is not the most, again, it's like the top priority. But having an engineer who's colorblind really helps, because he would be this sort of advocate, the vocal about it. You need somebody basically to be vocal about something, that's like a personal problem to them. That's the one way to get the whole team's attention, and we want to make sure it's somebody who we care about so closely, is having problems. Of course, we're all human beings, want to help other human beings. It makes the problem very, very personal to us too. But that's just like one disability we're talking about, right? We're not talking about everything that's out there that we don't prioritize. But we are trying hard to make sure that we want to accommodate, all kinds of, make sure that everyone is accessible to our product. But I do have to admit, it is not it's not always the top priority.
Okay. Okay, Joel, do you want to expand on your journey with accessibility and, because you're leading it in many ways, do you want to share your stance on it?
Yeah, this is something that's near and dear to me. I actually just gave us a talk at RailsConf a couple of weeks ago about really in depth what we're doing for accessibility at the company. And it's really been, I think, one of the most formative experiences in my career so far has been this specific project at GitHub. Before I get into that, I want to reiterate something Jessica said, which is I think that a huge turning point in our program, we have over 1,000 engineers. The most critical thing we did was hire someone who was blind. Mm-hmm. The trajectory of GitHub's accessibility, you could literally plot it on a graph from the day that we hired him in terms of our progress towards making the product actually useful for people with disabilities. But more generally, accessibility matters a ton to Microsoft. I don't know how much you all are aware of that, but it's a core part of Microsoft's approach to building products is that they are accessible from day one. It was actually part of the terms of GitHub's acquisition by Microsoft that we would hit certain accessibility targets on a certain timeline, and that's part of where my work has come in. I would kind of echo an earlier discussion as well about it being very pro-business. I think that I think I see a tide changing in the industry where accessibility is no longer going to be a nice to have. And there's two reasons why. One is that most customers are now requiring it. We are literally losing deals at GitHub because our product doesn't reach certain pretty high accessibility standards. There are customers that are literally waiting for us to hit certain milestones before they will buy our product. And that's existential. That's a money problem. If a competitor is accessible and we aren't, we lose that deal. it's like table stakes for a lot of customers, because they could end up in situations where they could have legal exposure if they are providing software to their employees that is not accessible for them. And of course, that is the big elephant in the room, which is there's significant legal risk in this area. Like Microsoft has faced and GitHub have faced significant legal pressure in this area. And I think that all of us in our careers will work at a company that will face legal pressure for accessibility. I am incredibly confident that that will be true if it isn't true already for those of us here. Because of that, accessibility is fundamental. I would say of the company priorities we have for all of GitHub, accessibility is one of the top 3 for the entire company at this point, which is pretty incredible to see. We have completely shifted our planning approach for everything we do at the company to be accessibility first, which means that every single thing we're doing, even if it's another priority, has to serve an accessibility goal. And what that means is that if we're making a business decision, it has to have an accessibility component to it, which is, I think, what has also kind of turned our trajectory around. The thing that I will say that from my experience, I think that is relevant to a general audience is that the more we've dug into truly making something great for people with disabilities, is that it breaks a lot of the molds of how we build software. And I can't go into any specific examples because of this format, but like what we've seen is that like our traditional approach of building things agilely, where we say build a minimum use case for a customer and then iterate from there, often does not work when you're trying to build a truly great accessible product, because often you can end up going down the path that could never be made accessible. And this is what's happened in a lot of our product is we come to a page and it's been iterated on, for 6 months with the feature life cycle we talked about earlier. And it is completely wrong. It's like intractably wrong. And we literally have to go back to a designer and just say, start from scratch. And that has happened way more than I expected. And as we go through some of the more complex areas of our product, it's basically 100% of the time that we have to do like a fundamental rewrite. That is really hard for a lot of organizations to grasp because they're really used to doing things in the agile way. And I think that that's something that a lot of companies are going to start to grasp with as they get this legal pressure, is it's going to have to change how we operate and think about designing our products.
Okay, thank you. Anton, do you want to share your efforts in trying to achieve accessibility in the products and interfaces you've designed, and maybe some like Martian efforts too?
Yeah, sure. That's like general discussion of accessibility. It's a tough discussion because especially when you design in a developer tool. I mean, of course, we in Martians, we also like starts creating even the first sketch, keeping the accessibility in mind, and it is built in our design system, certain amount of contrast that we apply and so on. So our practices is we use color models with perceptual hue axis, and we prefer OKLCH over HLC because it gives them more consistent results. And also, yeah, we like all the time check the contrast, and here we prefer APCA over VSAG because it gives again more consistent results, and especially it works better on for colors against the light backgrounds. And but yeah, that's kind of a tough, why it's a tough question, because when you design just a regular website or not very dense interface, it's kind of, yeah, it's okay. You just pick 1, 2, 3, 4 colors which with a good contrast, and you just colorize everything in these colors and you are good. But when you design very densely populated interface with a lot of information, with a lot of types of information and so on, you need to think about visual layers. And DevTools, it's an interface with incredible number of visual layers. I will explain what I mean by visual layers. Let's consider just an IDE interface code editor. So you have piece of code, and it consists of easily it can consist of like 50 tokens with different colors, because you need to visually make a distinction between different semantic parts of the code. And these tokens are not like consistent. You have some tokens that should be less noticeable because they like used less amount of time, for example, comments. And you have like a very noticeable one because it's a very important things, for example, data that you provide within your code and pass between different pieces of your program. And these tokens create layers. So you need something like dimmed, you need something like very bright. After that, you have some supportive elements around this code editor that allows you to work with the codes more efficiently and so on. And you have more and more layers around. So yeah, average developer tool that gives like a very that serves very intense task, that's like coding or drawing something. Yeah, it allows you to obliges you as a designer to think about like easily like dozens of different visual layers, and these visual layers should be very distinctive, which means you need to be a user needs to be able to like scan the current screen and finds information that belongs to certain visual layer, and without like stubbing all the time against information that they don't need. And that's why accessibility is a problem, because accessibility says just use the maximum contrast colors and you will be good. But designing of developer tools says, no, you need to think about these informational visual layers and make them very stand apart enough. And only then your interface will be like really usable. And the second problem is size of the text. Again, accessibility says that like use 18 pixels or something like that as a regular text font and you will be good. But you can't apply these as it is to developer tool, because you have tab bar, for example, with 20 tabs that represents different files. And if you apply these huge fonts, no one will use this interface as efficiently as if you apply just a tiny things, which considered as a no for regular design. And like fighting with that and finding again the sweet spots when it's still accessible, but it gives enough dense in terms of this layering, that's the crucial point of making the interface very accessible.
Okay, thank you. Let's go back a little bit to how we interact with the users, how our DevTool products interact with users. And let's talk about strategies of onboarding users properly. And Shannon, let's start with you. Maybe you can share some best practices of onboarding with us.
Sure, yeah. So I studied educational psychology and taught college level writing and created online learning experiences before becoming a product designer. So this is something I'm really passionate about, and it's fun to have a captive audience where I get to share the stuff that I like thinking about. Although I guess you all chose to be here, so hope this is fun. So I wanted to share like 3 to 4 methodologies or like ways of thinking about users who are new to an idea. So 3 to 4 methodologies that help them learn. The first one is help people experience something fun, like a quick win fast. And I remember Anton mentioning that you want people to you want to get them into like some of their daily or most important tasks in the product. And I think like helping them succeed at maybe like the smallest yet most common task that they're going to do and see a result, like see the system respond to them in a successful way, keeps them motivated, helps them see what value the product has for them. And it's a good way of learning too, because they're going to be doing that over and over again. Another thing is when you're new to something, you can only remember 3 to 7 things. It's actually like part of the psychology of why phone numbers are the number of digits they are, is because you can't memorize more than that very easily. So keep onboarding tours short. Don't try to get people to do more than 3 to 7 things. I would say 3 to 5, honestly. And they need to be small chunks too. Like advanced people also can only remember 3 to 7 things, but each thing is like huge and involves a lot of complexity. Okay, 2 more things. So 2 more strategies. Seeing examples of how other people use a tool is a really powerful learning experience. So let's say a user joins a product and they have other people they know and they're collaborating with them and they see how the other people are doing things. Super powerful learning experience. Maybe there's ways to share projects in open source communities or on, you know, some sort of like gallery of projects. That's a great way for people to learn from each other. Finally, oh, actually, the last one was like my least favorite thing. I think video tutorials can be pretty effective, but they are really difficult to maintain. They are so much effort. And then if anything changes, you have to redo that effort to update the video tutorial. So I would say, like, unless you have somebody who's like dedicated to make video tutorials as like their whole job, I would go other routes first. Try to improve your documentation, try to just make incremental improvements to the product, better onboarding flows. Video tutorials are a beast. So yeah, hope those tips are practical enough to be some valuable takeaways.
These are great, and I think that Joel can really expand on some of these because we have previously discussed, you know, onboarding at GitHub, and he shared some great insights. Joel, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think that so a lot of my context with this discipline is specifically around documentation for a design system, which is in and of itself a developer tool. I think that Shannon kind of hinted at, I think maybe my number one problem I see with documentation is that it's very easy for it to be detrimental. It's really easy for it to be out of date is the number one kind of problem we run into, that like as soon as someone is writing something down in Markdown or God forbid taking a screenshot or making like a video walkthrough, the chances of that information being relevant approach zero in a fairly short amount of time. Like we've seen documentation that goes out of date in a matter of, you know, weeks, if not months. And I would say in almost every case, documentation is going to contain some error within a year, if not significant errors. And what's really difficult for us as we've scaled is that, as you can imagine, when you're a big company, you build a lot of things, eventually you need to have things that maintain themselves indefinitely. We call it keep the lights on maintenance, which basically means that like you need to have it in a state where like it can just be there and no one can work on it. And that's important because you need to be able to keep building new things without paying a carrying cost for everything you've ever built before. You know, GitHub's 15 years old. If we had to maintain and invest in our documentation of everything we've ever built and only be adding to that burden every time we built something new, we'd be drowning, right? It just wouldn't work. So what we found is that we need to push our documentation to being derived from the software. So we do a lot of work to make it so that, say we write code comments that describe a specific part of the design system or of the application, that actually generates our documentation so that when the application changes, the documentation changes. And we'll even do that so far as auto-generating screenshots that are, you know, we'll use like a script that will actually navigate through the application and take screenshots of certain steps. So we can prove that we're actually showing you the application as it exists in its current state. In some areas, we actually push that all the way out where we drastically reduce our documentation because we found that like it's such a liability to keep it up to date that we'd rather use a dynamic tool. In our case, it's like Storybook and Lookbook are tools for design systems. Those are derived directly at runtime from the code. So you're able to have really good cohesion with them being up to date.
Awesome, thank you. Ayush, do you want to share some secret sauce on how to make great onboarding for users?
I don't know if it's secret because there's a lot of commonality in what Joel and Shannon have said, but I can definitely add some color. again, it's very often about connecting business goals and user goals. Onboarding is an exchange of information. You're learning about the product, but you're also learning about the customer. So figure out the right hooks there. So like one big piece is like make sure you give some customer delight before the hook, which is customers may have aversion to giving personal information before they see the value in your product. Make sure you are spending as much time optimizing and showing the value of your product early on. At Algolia, that's a very, very big aspect. Like we show our offerings very, very early on. Like you can see demos of how search works very well, for example, and making sure that the time to magic in terms of understanding what your product is doing is super important. Another really, really important thing during onboarding is customers, sometimes the developers, sometimes it might be from different communities, are evaluating your product. So make sure that these evaluations are as realistic as possible. So if you can provide real sample data sets, for example, from the case of a search perspective where you're using, I don't know, an e-commerce company or a streaming service so that people can imagine what kinds of databases that they are using and they can map it and they can think about how it works within their own product, it's really important. If you're playing with pseudodata, you can approximate and abstract it, but you won't really be able to say, this works great for my use case. And I think onboarding is also about getting faith in the system that you're using. Another big piece is an onboarding session is for a user, but you're onboarding a community of people onto your product. So consider your save points really, really well, because your first session will, as Shannon put it early on, like you will not learn everything in the first session. Mostly because it's not just you learning, it's everyone around you as well. So consider those save points really, really thoughtfully. Make sure that there are easy ways for a developer to pass on the mic or the keyboard, so to speak, to the person in charge of billing so they can input their credit card details very easily. To the person who's probably running BI software on top of the data so they can think about how that works. Because good onboarding requires all of these communities to work. A couple of other things that are really important is like being really clear and goal directed in the onboarding journey. People invest, like in reality, when you're onboarding a new product, it's a set of points on a Jira sprint. So make sure that people can estimate how long it's going to take, because that has a direct impact on the amount of information they can absorb. And lastly, I would say that make it easy for first day on the job users, which is to say, you may be onboarded as a product into a company, but you'll have a new influx of developers and new folks joining the team every day. They are still starting from scratch. So if you make sure that you're abstracting away the onboarded product from a new user onboarding on the company, because otherwise the blank screen that you see with typically empty graphs or like pseudographs will now be filled with real data, with business critical data, and making it easy and safe for new users to be able to use your products in spite of it being in an already production or scale situation is really, really important. So being able to give that safety while onboarding is very important in that sector.
Okay, thank you. Now we're entering kind of like a fun round, and we can make it a little bit of a speed round. Let's talk about common mistakes that we see in developer tools design. And let's start with Jessica. Jessica, what are your pet peeves?
Yeah. We all get very, very excited about new technologies. Right now, AI is super hot. And engineers, when they get excited, they want to learn everything about it. So they tend to kind of sometimes like it gets distracting sometimes. They get very deep in because they're extremely intelligent, smart people, and they want to just like soak it in that problem. So they tend to kind of move towards that product direction when it's not, it's sometimes deviates from where we are. So that is a kind of, we tend to like develop in muscles in our product that is unnecessary. That's probably what I would call it. So that's sort of like mistakes sometimes I see in products are developing too much on AI, just just completely unrelated to what they're doing and start developing like AI muscles. That is like some mistakes that I see in the world when people like us get super passionate about stuff. But as long as like it feels like the integrated as part of your product and it feels like you're solving the user problem, so you always want to bring it back to the user problem, to the technology that you're very excited about, then yeah.
Okay. Ayush, how about you? What do you think are some common mistakes that you see?
Yeah, I don't know if it's fun, but I will say that the developer tools that put me off the most are those that don't make me feel like an adequate developer. To be fair, I'm not a very strong developer, so it's very often, but the best tools are the ones that make me feel way more competent than I should be. Which is to say, if you can widen the spectrum of who gets to be a developer, because developers are really powerful, right? They can use code and they can do so many things in such good ways. If your developer tools make you seem like an expert, it puts you in a place where you can learn with confidence. So tools that make it hard for you to jump over, or you must be this tall to enter this ride, are the ones that put me off. And that's the most common mistake. Your developer tools not being approachable or not inclusive in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Anton, how about you? What are some mistakes that you see in product design?
Yeah, I can say, I think that's the biggest mistake is trying to apply patterns from web design. So a developer and designer might bring this experience that they accumulated designing consuming products, let's call it this way, and applying it to developer tools. But developer tools, as I consider it, they came from native applications. So the like an original place where DevTools started appear and evolve was desktop. So most of the application were desktop applications, and web was reserved for consuming products. And I think that it established quite a quite a firm like barrier between these two groups of applications. I mean that in a developer tool, it's very important to give this sense of control that all your data is yours, is like never will be washed away by something if something happened. On the contrast, web is very ephemerical thing. So your browser can log and reload your page, and your data might be lost. So recent tense is to like trying to avoid it even for regular websites, but still, I think that it exists. So web is something like temporary and not stable, and desktop is something very stable that you can trust. And when you and recently developer tools, they exist like in both of these worlds, and I think that most like very often they start as a web solution, and after that moves to desktop area by help of Electron or other technology. But developers, because they start developing a web interface, they think in these web patterns. So for example, in web, it's very common that all the elements react by hover and so on, like using pointer and other common sense things for web. But when you do a highly loaded interface for developer tool and apply these patterns, it makes interface like user feel that it's not like a fake, but it's still from web. It's not stable. Can I trust this interface? Can I enter just a big amount of data without thinking that it might be vanished away and so on? So it's very crucial, and like not thinking, not like switching the mindset when you are about to develop a developer tool is like the big mistake. And the second one that I want to bring up is that the mistake is like focusing on the main function of the developer tool. As I mentioned previously, you never know how this particular user will use your application. It might be the case that they use just a small fraction, and it doesn't mean that this user doesn't like the tool for 100%. They might do this because your application solves this tiny functionality in the best way on the market, and they use your application only for this functionality. And the mistake that I can see here is like focusing on the main functionality only and not noticing these like collateral use cases that might appear, and which you might find when you investigate your users, and like be very like not flexible in terms of like pivoting maybe at some point the developer tool and making this collateral case the main case. Yeah, these two mistakes I can bring up.
Yeah, I can relate to last one because I use Finder on my laptop for like calculator all the time. Like I literally never open the calculator app because I think that Finder does it like better.
Spotlight, I think you mean.
Yeah, Spotlight. Yeah. Shannon, do you want to talk about your pet peeves in product design for DevTools?
Sure. Kind of similar to what Jessica was talking about earlier, which is focusing on user problems instead of other things that could be distractions. I guess I've just had a lot of experiences where sometimes like on the back of my mind, I'll be like, wait, why is everyone so excited about this project? Like, why are we working on it? And why aren't we doing that thing that we all knew was important? And it just for some reason isn't getting done. And I think usually the answer is like, it can be scary to do hard things. And sometimes the hard thing, if it is the most important problem to solve, just making sure somebody owns it and is committed to like seeing it through is really important. And if it's you that gets assigned or you decide to take it upon yourself, I think there's a way to make it come to life for people and make it seem fun. Because actually it is fun to build things that work for people and to design things that work for people. Even if it doesn't look as glamorous as maybe like, oh, let's just like redesign our... I just had times where people are like, let's just like redo our marketing website, and people can just talk about it for hours and days and weeks, and it might not improve the product at all. So yeah, that's it. Yeah, just important to know like why you're doing stuff and be brave enough to ask why people are focused on something and figure out what's most important.
Okay, Joel?
Yeah, I would say to build on Shannon's response, I think that I take an even more extreme approach, which is when we're working on a new, really any change to the GitHub application under my purview, the thing I ask whoever's leading it is really simple. It's what thing that is not true today will be true when you're done. Mm-hmm. And just being able to answer that question has cut a lot of the cruft out of our process for building great tools, because as Shannon was saying, like people can say they can have a desire to do something, but they might not know exactly why, and they they might not be able to tell you when they've actually achieved that goal. And I think that those things are really sorely missing, especially, I think we've kind of, through this discussion today, talked about how much scrutiny developer tools are under. And I think that the people we're building these tools for deserve like the level of quality that comes from that careful attention. I will say that like my biggest pet peeve that's like specific to this genre, I think, is what I would just call like scope creep, or just continuous adding of information to user interfaces. We have a list of like what we call the GitHub Zen, which is like 10 core principles that guide our culture. And one of them is anything you add dilutes everything else. And that can be from a design perspective, but what we've also found is that when we do that from a design perspective, it actually has really kind of sneaky engineering effects down the line too, because everything you add to the page is something that has to likely come from a database. And what we found is that a designer will want to add something and it will be a great idea, but they won't recognize that, say for the 5% of our customers that are the largest, it will add a quarter of a second to the page load time. This is something I've actually dealt with recently, where we had a feature that was added, universally loved, but we basically had to turn it off for bigger customers because we hadn't like thought through the implications of that scope creep from an engineering perspective.
Okay, thank you. We are approaching our time limit, so let's maybe super fast go through the last question. I like to end those sessions on the warm fuzzies. Basically a good, like feel-good story about, a design pattern or something that you've seen in other products or in your product. And we will do the screen share now once it's I can share my screen? Okay. Second. Okay. So let's start with Ayush and his example of warm fuzzies.
Yeah, I would love to share some of the cool things we're building at Algolia, specifically with AI powered tools. But in my past, like building the page design system was really valuable because of the ways that we approach shaping like accessibility and inclusive design across a very old code base,
Mhm.
and one that supported both internal and external customers, which meant you had to build both a design system and a component library using the same code
Mhm.
base, which was very challenging. And the studio was a drag and drop code builder, which allowed customers to build communications without knowing much coding, and it led to some really powerful use cases by folks who were previously considered non-technical, and really helped my goal around like widening the spectrum of who gets to be a developer. So it was a really, really
Mhm.
empowering tool for me to build early on in my career. Those are two things that I'm especially proud of.
Cool. Let's move to Shannon. Do you want to share your warm fuzzy?
Sure. Yeah, I thought I'd just talk about the one project I brought up at the very beginning, which was the Gatsby's plugin library. Just this slide and the next one. This one shows what it used to be, which was basically there was a docs page on how to use plugins, and then there was at the bottom of the docs page, you can see on the right there, that's just a screenshot of a list of plugins. So it was a list of links to GitHub repos for each plugin. And if you could go to the next slide, just to show what it was after. So this is the tweet when we shipped the plugin library on the left there.
Oh, should I?
Yeah,
Okay.
just stay there. Just stay there. So it had a search bar. It was a scrollable list of cards, and then any card you selected would show you the README on the right side. And it simplified the user flow, like what they were already doing. And the reason this is so hard, like such a warm fuzzy for me, is if you look over on the right-hand side, it says 3,205 results. That's the number of plugins today. And when we started, there were like 50. And
Wow.
I just love seeing like a community be able to build things for each other, that everybody's using each other's stuff. And a lot of these are like source plugins, so people could just build more awesome websites because they could pull data from like anywhere into them. And yeah, just trying to like seeing a what felt like kind of a simple project, but just took like okay, I'm gonna do this, just do the work and ship it, make a big difference. So I don't know. That's awesome to me. It's great to see the community like dive into it and help each other so much.
Yeah, I also love how it's we have Algolia here on your slide, it's like a perfect perfect cross reference.
Search by Algolia.
Next we have Joel. You don't have any images, but maybe you can share just, verbally, what's your warm fuzzy?
Oh, for me, I don't think anything will ever top building dark mode for GitHub. That was one of my first kind of like UI architect level things for the company. And I came in about halfway through the project. It took us 2 years of work, engineering and design wise, to ship dark mode, because we had to completely rewrite so much of the behind the scenes, like CSS architecture, to support it. And what was really great is that we realized early on in the process that there was an opportunity to use that work to enable a lot of other future design goals. Like basically, we wrote the entire application to use CSS variables, and that's now paid off in that we now have colorblind themes. We have high contrast themes. And it's now to the point where, if you wanted to, you could write a user style sheet that actually just themed GitHub however you wanted it to be. And just a really fun, powerful experience for me to see like how these things, when you do them well, can have huge payoffs that like kind of build on them on each other, over time.
Yeah, sounds awesome. Thank you. Jessica, do you want to share yours?
Yeah, it's about 2
Speaking
years
of
dark mode.
AI trends, yeah.
Yeah, you can actually go to playbook.com/AI. Also, that is our, oh, we're
Slash.
actually no .com.
Oh, sorry. /.com. .ai. /AI.
Yeah. Yeah. We're launching a product hunt soon, so this is our way to
Cool.
this is how AI interacts with human creativity. So everything else, there's people written this, copy, and then you turn on the little shrimp at the top, the little shrimp.
Like this? Okay.
No, there's a small like toggle AI shrimpy.
Oh.
Oh no, sorry, go back. This is the only dark mode that we did in our company,
Oh,
even though
I
everyone's
see.
asking for
Oh,
it.
that's so cute. It was
So
underneath my Zoom
yeah,
controls, so I couldn't see it.
it's just how the like AI created art can be part of, human creation. So it makes us all superhumans. So that's the theme that we're going for.
I love it.
This is a new paradigm that we start seeing is that people are starting to store AI art in Playbook, including prompts. So that is something like storage would we tend to overlook in the past, a text and image together and variations on top. So we were just observing it. We talked to a couple of users, and then that is like the workflow. So we're trying to adapt to the new paradigm shift in this industry. So you can see the prompt is getting stored with an image itself, and you can see a bunch of like what we call groups. So there's a whole bunch of variations that came with it. It gets stored almost like automatically. So
Cool.
that's something that we're just working on now.
Very cool. Lastly, Anton.
Yeah.
Tell me
we
what
also
to do here. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we also have a AI feature, and I like this story behind this functionality because it was the middle of December. ChatGPT just launched a few weeks ago, and people just started realizing that it's awesome technology and it can be applied in many ways. And the client recognized this opportunity, came to us and said, like, we need to build this feature. It's like a future of making API requests. And we designed this feature from scratch within 2 weeks. 1 week was spent into preparation. So we launched from the beginning to the launching on only 3 weeks passed. And try to type in the URL bar something like HTTP repo details right here. Right, repo details. Yeah. So you just, instead of typing the URL and other things, you just can type your prompt right in the URL bar. And after that, we make the call to and press accept. All right, and send this request. Right. So that's kind of the full life cycle. Yeah. So we designed it quite quickly, and we were among the first products that integrated this feature. I mean, like maybe the 20th or something like that. And nowadays there are like thousands of these tools, and it gave us like a huge recognition from the community. Like everybody loved, especially design, and I'm very proud of this feature. That's one of the reasons why I'm proud. Yeah, and it gained some new followers and new adopted users for the customer as well. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. I mean, yeah, we kind of have to experiment with AI, don't we? Like at the end of the day, we're all faced with this dilemma right now, and we're also working on some other things AI related, which is a lot of fun because we get to explore the new technology, but as Jessica said, it's important to not like over engineer. Thank you guys for being experts at this panel today. This was like a great pleasure. I feel like I'm in the first row of like the best movie. Very informative, and you are also different with all your different experiences. I am really grateful and that you are here today and you got to spend a little bit of time with us. And I want to announce the next episode is going to be in June, and it's going to be dedicated to bootstrapping and fundraising, which is a hot topic for many startups. So stay tuned, and thank you for your attention today. Thank you very much.